And now joining us to explore the issue in greater detail is Gary Tabach, retired US Navy captain, also former chief of the NATO Anti-Terrorist Center. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, Janusz. Hello, TVP World. Always great to be. And hello, Poland. And Merry Christmas, Poland. And as a person of Jewish faith, I miss Polish Christmas a lot.
Before we actually focus on the main topic, which is the frontline situation, as someone who was involved in anti-terrorist operations, what is your impression on the tragedy that happened in Kazakhstan, the Azerbaijani airliner that was most likely struck by a missile? Would you say that this is the most likely reason, judging by the available footage and also other information that we have?
Well, yes, Janusz, I think that most of the experts that are looking at the pictures and looking at the whole scenario, saying that it was a missile, it was a Panzer, that missile that hit that airline, Azerbaijani airline. And of course, condolences to all the people that were killed in this tragic incident, and the heroic events of the pilots who were able to drag the airplane through across the sea and land it and save at least some of the lives, yet sacrificing their own. I think we should wait for the investigation, and there's because we know when the airplane took off. We know if there was a missile fired. We're watching the area. We always know those things. We knew what happened to the Malaysian airline when the Russians shut them down. And it's also going to depend on how the Azerbaijan, how the Kazakhstan, if they're going to cooperate with us. But I think we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And I know a lot of people saying it's a terrorist act. We should be very, very careful, because every act that the Russians commit, or every crime that Russians commit, not necessarily terrorist acts, because we also had an accident one time when we shot, I believe, a South Korean airline down many years ago, about 40 years ago, and it was a mistake. It was a mistake on our part, and we paid for it. And those things happen sometimes, especially in a war zone. But what I'm afraid is that the Russians are going to deny again. They're going to deny again, like they denied it with the Polish president and his entourage, like they denied it with the Malaysian airline, and they're going to deny it again, and they're going to say it's Ukrainians. They're going to blame everybody in the world and will not accept the responsibility. I just wish that once they would come out and say, listen, we made a mistake. We're the ones that shut down, and we're going to pay. We're going to pay retribution. We're going to pay compensation to the families of the people who died and the people who got hurt in that incident. But something tells me they're not going to do that.
No, the initial response from Russia was that a flock of birds was responsible. I haven't ever seen a flock of birds capable of puncturing the fuselage of an aircraft, especially the tail section. For some reason, that would have been rather unusual. But now, let's move on to the front line, because Russia is great at dissembling, right? Russia has great experience when it comes to twisting the facts. On the front line, though, it is all about blunt, brutal force. Do you think that, regrettably, the strategy that Russia has been using in Ukraine is bringing it some limited successes right now?
Well, it is bringing successes. I'm not sure if they're limited or not. They do advance. The price they're paying in human life, I think, traditionally is they don't regard that as high ever. Throughout the history, and who might tell it to the Polish people, they know it better than anyone else. I think that sometimes the Russians, not sometimes, but Russians always use very brutal and bloody ways of advancing, and including themselves. They don't care how many people they're going to get killed. Ukrainians are standing and they're trying to repel them as much as they can. But again, the lack of weapons, the lack of support from the West. How much longer? We gave Ukrainians 3 days. This is 3 years already that is going on, and the Ukrainians are slowly, but they're retreating because they have lack of people already. They have lack of motivation, and they have lack of support, primarily from the United States and primarily from the Europe, old Europe. So a lot of times the many commentators are now saying, yeah, but the Russians, there are more Russians are getting killed because they're advancing, and there are fewer Ukrainians getting killed, but there are more Russians to begin with, and there are fewer Ukrainians. Also, I think that, I don't know if it's proper for me to say because human life is a human life, but reality is such that, and I hope people forgive me for what I'm about to say, but the reality is such that the Russians are losing not the best representatives of Russia. They're not scientists, they're not computer geeks, they're not doctors or nurses or lawyers or reporters or educated people. They're losing drunks, bums, and convicts that they get out of prisons, and they're throwing them by thousands at that. Russians have always done that. But Ukrainians, on the other hand, are losing creme de la creme of their society. They're losing the best young people. They're losing the future. So even if there's 1 to 10, and many times people count them, yeah, well, but the Russians are losing more. They're getting more Russians getting killed. Yeah, but the quality, again, it's not the right way to say it, but the quality of the population that the Ukrainians are losing and the quality or non-quality of the Russians that the Russians are losing is a huge difference.
And it is also the case that many of Ukrainians are dying way beyond the front lines because of the attacks directed against civilian targets. This is a major difference, again, that we're seeing. Ukraine mostly targeting ammo depots or refineries, whereas Russia, mostly civilian buildings, power stations, parts of the power grid, and things like that. But let's actually look at the frontline situation for a moment, like from a slightly greater distance. What do you think could be the worst case scenario if the Russians continue to use the so-called meat wave attacks? Again, it's a very brutal way of putting that. Regrettably, this is what Russia does, as you said, complete disregard of the lives of its own soldiers. And if they are successful at using this strategy, what do you think could be the worst thing that could happen before any sort of negotiations may begin?
Well, hopefully negotiations will come soon, but if a scenario plays out as you put it, it's not only that. It is also not only the soldiers at the front, as you put it, well dying, but it's also the civilians in the rear. But also civilians are dying because there is lack of heat, there's lack of medicine. People are scared. A lot of older people getting heart attacks. A lot of people are just scared, and they're starting to run away. They're starting to leave Ukraine because they're trying to save their kids and save their lives. It's all very natural things for normal humans to do, instead of having meat attacks, as you were saying, advances. So Ukraine probably will not last much longer if this will continue that way. So the worst case scenario is that we disengage and we leave Ukraine to be destroyed. And an idea such as Ukraine and an idea such as Ukrainian people will disappear. And this would be tragic, of course, I think, for not only Ukrainian people, but for the whole world. And again, I don't think if God forbid that happens, that's where Putin will stop. His appetite just grows more and more. So what do you... Yeah.
It is like, the worst thing that could happen in terms of Putin's maximalist goals, right? But what do you think is the most likely option right now? As you're watching the new U.S. administration preparing to take over in January, do you think that, ironically enough, Russia is the one that's actually undermining its own position? Because Ukraine, even though it doesn't want to lose its territory forever, said, well, if we have to, we will negotiate. Russia, that doesn't seem like they even want to start this process in good faith. They might be dissembling, they might be trying to come to the negotiating table, then disengage, then engage again. During the Minsk process, apparently, they were doing this all the time. Do you think that by doing this, though, they will basically cause the US to say, okay, enough is enough, we're going to end this, but not by making concessions, but by helping Ukraine more?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. And I think it is to predict President Trump and his team, it is not a good idea, because definitely he's keeping his plan of what to do is very close to himself. He's not opening up his cards. He's not opening up his aces, and or his trumps, let me say. You know, if we really, it's hard for me to predict those things, but I can tell you with all of my experience with fighting terrorism and dealing with terrorists most of my career, it is a terrorist state we're dealing with. They can do a lot of damage, blow up a dam, you know, explode another nuclear reactor, cause all kinds of damage to Ukraine and to the world. We're dealing with a terrorist state. But if we look at the way Hamas and Hezbollah has been negotiating with the Israelis, who do you think trained them to do that? They're trained by the Russians to do this terrorist. You know, goes back to the Napoleonic wars when the Russian partisans were operating there. So I think that President Trump and his team, and with General Kellogg, who's very experienced at that, are planning something, because we know that right now the head of the Russian nuclear agency has come out with a warning saying that Trump's administration should not conduct any nuclear testing, underground testings, which would be an escalation. That would be an escalation. So they are worried about it. They're what we say, they have been blinking now, but they're negotiating as the terrorists would negotiate. First, turn everything down. Of course, they are at advantage because Ukrainian troops are retreating and they are advancing regardless of the price they're paying. So it'll take a combination of things, but I think that President Trump has some sort of a plan, because it's not just Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. It's Europe and it's China and it's India, it's Saudi Arabia, it's oil prices, it's sanctions, it's many other things that will have to come into play. And not least, it's Ukraine itself. It's the way Ukrainians will behave, the way Ukrainian foreign ministry will act. Sometimes we know, and I think Polish people and Europeans and we Americans and Israelis know, that the foreign ministry of Ukraine sometimes is not helping us. Let's put it this way.
So many different factors. One quick question to round up our conversation. 2025, do you think this is the year when we are going to see the end of major fighting in Ukraine?
You know, Janusz, you're the first reporter who asked me that question. We will see the finish of major fighting. Usually they ask, will we see the end of the war? But it's also, what do you consider the end of the war or the end of the fighting? But the major fighting, yes, I believe that the major fighting will have to stop. Otherwise, there's going to be huge problems for all of us. So major fighting will stop. But will the war stop? Will the conflict will stop? No, of course not. This is a long, you know, soothing, bleeding wound that will continue to bleed for many, many years. Maybe like Israeli-Arab situation that will continue, and there will be land and there will be, you know, firefights. But hopefully it will come to the way it was during the prior President Trump's presidency, where there were some skirmishes, but there were no mass killings and there were no destruction of cities. So, but this is a difficult neighbor you have. You know, gladly Poland doesn't have that neighbor, although from Königsberg or from Kaliningrad region you do. But in a sense, there is a buffer zone that's Ukraine for you and for Europe. So we should not give up on them. We should help them to sustain that. But they will be taking the first hits and they will be the brunt of it. But the more Ukrainians will take advantage of that ceasefire, or that, as you well put it, major fighting, and rebuild their military industry, rebuild their military, make it more professional, the more they're going to be prepared for the next war with Russia, and the more we're going to be prepared for the next war with Russia, the less likely the chance that there will be the next war.
So a sobering, but also in a way, cautiously optimistic assessment there. Gary Tabach was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Always glad to be here. Bye-bye.
And with this, we conclude this episode of Ukraine This Week. I'm Janusz Rediński. Thank you for watching.